Hello everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. As an award-winning data-focused CRO, MMS has a keen awareness of the impact of the current pandemic on clinical research and trial data. This is the focus of today's discussion, and over the coming months, the MMS team of data experts will be bringing you a new monthly webinar on a variety of topics in a series titled Expert Insights. These webinars are just that. Insights from our global team of highly respected data and regulatory experts across 4 continents. I'm your host for today, Don McLean, and today's webinar is focused on recommended changes in companies and how to manage associated risks in response to COVID-19. Here today to present is Barbara Rusin and Ben Kaspar. Barb is Senior Regulatory Compliance Manager at MMS, providing technical compliance inputs including compliance program development to pharma, biotech, and CRO clients. Prior to MMS, Barb was a bio-research monitoring investigator and biologics specialist with the Food and Drug Administration's Detroit District Office. Ben Kaspar is a global regulatory manager and has been a leader with MMS for more than a decade. Ben supports pharma sponsors with their drug development planning and regulatory strategies. And last year, Ben earned the inaugural Outstanding Client Service Award at MMS for delivering value to clients beyond the expected. As a reminder, your microphones will be muted for the duration of this session, and we'll send a recording out following this call. And if you have any questions, please enter them in the Q&A. With that, I'll turn it over to Barbara Rusin. Barb.
Thank you, Don. Hi, this is Barbara, and I'm very honored to be speaking to you today. What we'd like to cover, as Don noted, is the discussion of the impact of COVID-19 on your clinical trials and the adjustments needed to stay on course. So, apologies, there we go. So what we'd like to focus on are the sponsors, as sponsors and as providers of CROs. What are your considerations and what should you be focusing on as we move forward with our plans and how we cope with COVID-19 and the global shutdowns that we've experienced? So of course, our paramount considerations in this area are the safety of our trial participants and maintaining compliance with any regulations, including privacy regulations and guidance documents, and then any regulations that have come up in regards to social distancing and other issues that we've dealt with just directly related to the pandemic. Of course, you also want to minimize your risk to your data and trial integrity as you go through this. So what we would like to help you do is identify and manage your risks with a focus on clinical sites, vendors, internal processes, how the changes may impact statistical analysis plans, and quality and acceptance of your application in the end. So what I will cover are your risks and how to handle them in regards to clinical sites, vendor management, your internal processes, and somewhat the impact on statistical analysis. Ben will then follow me and consider the quality and acceptance of your application, including how to manage statistical anomalies, statistical issues that may arise. We will not be speaking to specific issues, but we will speak at a high level and welcome your questions and additional follow-up after. So what we would like to start with, of course, is what is your risk during clinical trial document, during clinical trial conduct? What comes after you've adopted the guidance documents from the EMA, from the FDA, and from other countries, and how you implemented those? So as our white paper pointed out, you had many, many things to do to follow the guidance documents and maintain compliance and ensure that your study moved forward as much as possible. So what you've probably already experienced are changes to your study documents, including your protocol, potentially your ICF, your IB. You've had a lot of issues with pharmacovigilance, probably a lot more SAE and AE reporting. If that hasn't happened, it will. But what we'd like you to consider are the risks that you added to your portfolio when you had to implement such changes. So how do you make sure that your documents are maintained adequate? How do you make sure that your internal policies and procedures are now adequate, you're in compliance with them and with regulations? So our agenda will focus on each of these areas, changes to study documents and how to handle those risks, risk with pharmacovigilance, risk with your internal policies and procedures, vendor management and oversight, auditing programs, and what you should change or consider changing in regards to what audits you do and how you do them. And then lastly, looking at your personnel training and what risks you might have there and how to handle those and mitigate them. So of course, we're going to start with your study documents. Many companies have had to alter protocols and change their visitation windows, use off-site visits with physicians, use televisits for physician visits and assessments, altered the way their specimen collections have been completed, etc. So one of the things that we want people to consider at this point, since we've been in this situation for several months now, is take a step back and look at where your risks are because you've handled the risks related to COVID-19. Internally, your risks start with, do all the documents that you've had to alter now align? If you've altered your protocol, is it aligned with your IB? Is your ICF aligned? In addition, is there continuity in regards to what the IB and the pharmacy manual say? So we highly recommend that you take a look at your portfolio and ensure that if you have multiple protocols, they've been modified similarly for the same drug. If you have a protocol and you've not modified an ICF, do that review and make sure that you have that aligned. We would also like to present that you ensure that your submissions are completed. And Ben can help speak to this as well, but some of the submissions that you have for regulatory health authorities were allowed to be put in one large bulk application, but have all the changes been included in that? Have you put in all your applications with all your IRBs or IECs that are required? So sometimes once we go through, particularly as we do emergency changes to our protocols and our ICFs, the IRB submissions and IEC submissions may fall behind because particularly clinical sites that might be doing these on their own or CROs that are overwhelmed with the submission processes may have missed one. So it's worth your time to go back and look at the risks that you have with these. How many changes did you have? Make sure that you have all these approvals in place, both from your independent boards as well as your regulatory health authorities. If you've not submitted the changes to regulatory health authorities, Ben will be speaking a little bit about how you put all of your changes into one individual submission and you don't do many small submissions. The EMA in particular has requested that this be done in one bulk submission with an eye toward not doing multiple submissions so that they're not as overwhelmed. I'm sure that many of you have already gone through this process, but going through and doing some fine detailed review and ensuring that you've had everything submitted is very important at this time because it could affect negatively an inspection or a submission later on. And then what you will also want to consider is if you've had to implement something in an emergent situation in particular, for subject protections, for example, that you've documented a deviation from your protocol or a deviation from your internal standard procedures or your policies. The deviations in this area, the FDA and the EMA have both agreed, you can write a single deviation document that covers all your clinical sites if they're all affected. Or if there's a subset of clinical sites, the sponsor can write a deviation document for that particular subset, and that can be used by the sites in their records and by you in your records to indicate that the deviation was related to COVID-19. There needs to be that detail in there, but also that what types of management mitigation you put in place to prevent any additional issues arising. So what mitigations have you had so that the subject protections are followed up? For example, if you've had to remove subjects or subjects have had to go to another clinical site on an emergent basis, have you done your submissions to your regulatory authorities? So that level of detail needs to be there. The same goes for protocol deviations. If you've had a lot of protocol deviations, for example, missed visits with an entire, for example, Italy maybe, or even the US in New York, if you've had a lot of missed visits in a particular geographical region, you can write one single deviation for all of the sites in that region. and include it in your study documents, and the site can do so as well. Or you can let the sites write them themselves. So these are things that you need to take a look at now that you've had your first rush through changes in documents and changes in subject management. Go back and take a look at these and make sure that you've documented this appropriately. It is still an appropriate time to do that. It's never too late. If you have not followed your internal process for documenting deviations in a timely fashion, of course, that becomes another deviation. But again, an explanation with reason is an appropriate tool. So the other thing that we would urge people to do is check their privacy protections. The ECRFs, the EDCs, safety reports, any committee documents for safety committees such as DSMBs or IDMCs, you will want to go back and take a look at these protections and make sure that they haven't been compromised in any fashion, and make sure that any changes that you've made have not accidentally gathered personal information that they should not have gathered. We may have that happen when you go to a non-approved clinical site because you've had to use an emergency site, for example. Safety committee reports, if things are coming through very, very quickly, somebody could have accidentally missed de-identifying some documents. So that is an area that you will need to mitigate. In addition, there have been many, many EDCs, electronic data capture systems with ECRFs in them, that have been updated in a very, very quick fashion. This is the point at which you will want to go back and revalidate the EDC if that change has been significant, or if you've changed interfaces or added ECRFs to make sure that nothing has been altered. In many cases, there may have been a validation done already, but if not, you will want to go back and consider this because it will be a risk down the road during an inspection. So lastly, what we want to look at are your statistical analysis plans, or your SAPs, and protocol changes. The SAP needs to be proactively changed, but if it was not, if you have not yet had a meeting with your regulatory authorities, it is now time to discuss those changes. Expected will be study population changes. Changes in study endpoints are also possible. You may have alterations in your biospecimen collections, shipment, testing. New testing labs, for example, may be used with changes in platforms. You might be using local laboratories that are testing specimens for you, and you now need to collect the normals, and you'll have to somehow account for them having a different normal than your central laboratory. So that changes your statistical approach and your statistical analysis. So it's very, very recommended that if you have not gone back to the authorities and described the kinds of issues that may be ongoing and upcoming, because you may have laboratories that were open until now, but as the pandemic goes in waves across each country, that central laboratory becomes affected later. You need to maintain an open discussion with the regulatory authorities to talk to them about how your statistical analysis plans have changed. In addition, you'll have an ever-changing population as people become affected or become afraid or start to go out. So your populations change over time as well. And this will be something that'll be a bit of a moving target. Your SAP may not be written and never change again as we go through the recovery and subsequent waves of this pandemic. So an open discussion with them is very, very important. You will have to, in the end, consider the impact of your SAP on your marketing application and whether or not it affects your ability to do the application at this point, if you should have to shut down the study, or if you can have a smaller population. And these are discussions that you'll have to have with your regulatory advisor. And this is an area that's marked for Ben to discuss as he goes through his presentation at the end. Okay, so another area of risk that you have is pharmacovigilance. You probably had some changes to your IB or pharmacy manual if you have any drug related to immunocompromisation, or if you've had any drug related to that might affect similar systems as the virus. So you also might have COVID-19 complications that affect your disease, or the disease that you're treating is makes people more susceptible to COVID-19. So any of these changes need to be taken into account, and your pharmacovigilance system may be negatively impacted by more reports for your particular disease. And then you may also have changes in subject management because of underlying disease, comorbidities, medications that they're taking, just because of the population that you're dealing with. So as you look at your pharmacovigilance, you need to make sure that you have the manual updates, that if you haven't done all of them already, take a look at all of the risks associated with your disease, not just the immediate impact of COVID-19 on immunological issues, but take a look at any medications your patients are on as we learn more and more about this disease and its effects, such as inflammation. It again becomes a bit of a moving target, so this is something that you need to be aware of and continue to assess the need for a change in your IB to warn your physicians about what to look out for that may be a comorbidity that you didn't know yet. So this really keeps your medical review personnel on their toes. You may even consider adding an independent review committee or an adjudication committee if you start to see comorbidities that significantly impact your patient population. Then also with pharmacovigilance, you'll want to take a look at your changes to your safety laboratory. If you have a central lab where you're getting limitations, again, this is going back to something I already mentioned, but you might get a local lab use. And so the normals and the description of the platform testing, the certification, you need to make sure that's all in place. But this can also affect your pharmacovigilance because the PV reports may be using one set of normals, and you want to make sure that your PV team is aligning the correct laboratory normals with the correct reports. And it may become a bit confusing for anybody doing your PV reviews. So make sure that there are appropriate processes in place to mitigate any of these issues that might be ongoing for you and might arise sporadically. Again, as I noted, Ben will be going through the effects on the overall SAP in your application. You'll also want to develop methods to manage increased number of safety reports. I think these are pretty logically expected in the current situation. You'll want to ensure robustness and ease of staffing and process. So this might be an area where you want to add more robust procedures. You might want to simplify and streamline procedures. You might want to have staff handle individual protocols because there might be something where there's a comorbidity with one disease that there is not with another. These are all considerations that you should take. Again, you might want to add a DSMB or an AC. You might want to add personnel to them if you're seeing a large crush. I don't expect, as an expert in this area, to see you have to add anything to your DSMB or AC, but it's definitely an individual consideration to mitigate any risk to your patients. And then again, you want to also continuously assess your informed consent form and your need for protocol amendments, as this is a changing environment and we learn more and more about this virus and its long-term effects. Finally, in regards to pharmacovigilance, as I've alluded to, you want to determine your adequacy of your own procedures and your completeness of the report. You might at this point, and we urge you at some point down the road, to do an internal process audit to make sure that you've captured all of the reports appropriately, that you've done all the redactions appropriately. And you want to do the same thing with your vendor. And you don't want to wait until your marketing application goes through. This should be something that when things are more under control and you're starting to see more consistency, that's when we would recommend a process audit of you or your vendor to make sure that they are continuously doing a good job and that you can correct any errors that you've had, see if those errors have affected any patients that remain on your study. And if you do those corrections while the study is ongoing, it's much more favorable in the eyes of a regulatory authority because you've been able to identify your own issues and maintain control of your study, which is the ultimate goal, is to maintain control. And you're showing that you are really devoted to your subject safety, which is the #1 concern with any study. So then the questions come down to internal policies and procedures. So what kinds of changes have you had? Have you had changes to the way you provide an informed consent form? In this period, what we've seen a lot of are sponsors taking on remote or electronic provisions of ICFs because patients are ill, because patients are distant and can't get to the clinical site. You might email them an electronic consent and do documentation of that email. You might have a remote paper-based provision, and if the person's in quarantine, you cannot get a copy of that paper. In some instances, there are facilities that are taking pictures of the informed consents, saving them, having a witness attest to the completion of them, and then burning them. And this is not unheard of. This also happened during the AIDS crisis with some AIDS patients. But these are all things that you might be implementing or facing moving forward. You want to make sure that your policies and procedures allowed for this. If they have not, as we've noted, you want a protocol deviation. So ensuring that you have adequate protocol deviation or adequate procedure deviation management is very important. So this might lead to upgrades in your QMS process, but at least make sure that you have allowances to do this and that you've mitigated any changes you've made by documenting the deviation, documenting why, and moving forward with development of a new policy or procedure if you plan on continuing to use the alteration and process, for example, electronic provisions of ICFs, which was already in process in our field, and then making sure that if you're not going to continue using it, that you have a clean cutoff date, or if it's just going to go through that particular study, that you note that, and you manage it through your quality management system appropriately. So in regards to protocol deviation and documentation, again, as noted, consider a single listing of protocol deviations. Consider a need for agreement or plan changes, because if you've had a protocol deviation that affects all your sites and affects your monitoring, for example, do you want to continue additional remote monitoring? Do you need to change your monitoring plan so that there's an allowance for them to have missed the number of visits they did that were on site? And if you don't want to change that plan, then make sure you adequately document that through a deviation. So these are, again, are all kinds of follow-up things that don't necessarily immediately come to mind, but things, documentation that an auditor or an inspector or an investigator would look for. In vendor management and oversight, what we've seen are a lot of companies have to bring on additional vendors, whether that be for shipping of specimens, shipping of investigational product, a return of investigational product, even to provide in-home nursing or telecare. Those are all vendors that, if they were brought on very quickly, may not have gone through an appropriate vendor qualification or assessment process. At this point is the time to identify who you brought on, make sure that they were assessed and qualified appropriately, and if they were not, then document the deviations again, and this is a repeated theme, and make sure that you manage those deviations appropriately through your quality system. If you're going to maintain them for a long time, make sure that you put quality plans in place. But every vendor that you've added, you can still go back and qualify them and document why they weren't qualified or assessed at the time. It's very, very reasonable. Every authority has stated that they expect things to be documented appropriately for deviations, and that's a repeated theme with them as well, because they know that you couldn't react to this pandemic with the speed that you might have reacted to other changes with. You would have put them off, you would have put every vendor through the process that you needed to. But they know that that wasn't possible in this particular case. So there will be a lot of leeway given by inspectors and investigators if you adequately manage the risks that you found yourselves creating. Not just related to the disease, but related to all the changes you've had to make to manage your study relative to the disease. And again, with the IP shipment and accountability, when you've had direct to subject shipment, just making sure in regards to accountability that you have had development of records that you're maintaining and documentation that you're maintaining to show shipping, receipt, and return if there is a return, or documentation that you're subject to test to destruction in home if they had anything left over. Where are your FedEx labels going, or your DHS delivery labels going? Just to make sure that you maintain all of that. That's something that we don't think about, and normally the sponsor definitely doesn't have to think about maintaining that because it's kept at an IP pharmacy or at the site if it's a device. You've, again, as I've noted, had changes to monitoring plans, or the way the number of visits that have been conducted or the types of visits that conducted. Make sure that your monitoring plan is updated. Make sure that you've had a deviation for the monitoring plan agreed to by both parties, just to document what's been happening here. What is their relative responsibility for IP accountability? Make sure that you have had all these vendors have machine maintenance and calibration, that you get those records in retrospect, not just qualify them, but follow up with them to make sure that they're doing the right thing. You might have to just do a full audit to set them up and make sure that they're where they're supposed to be. If you've added clinical sites that were not that were not already enrolled with your study, you need to do the same thing there as well. And then as you've done this and moved very, very quickly, you will probably have many telephone conversations and email communications. These are most often what we as auditors and inspectors find are missing from documentation of a study. It's important to note that the requirements for a TMF or an eTMF are that you be able to reconstruct the study in its entirety. So having a policy about how you maintain your telephone and email communications is important. If you don't have one, now's the time to think of doing one, but go back and make sure that you've saved those very, very important communications. If you've had a telephone conversation, you can write minutes of that conversation and have both parties agree. Write an email and say, this is what we discussed, want to confirm, and you can confirm it that way. But maintain documentation somehow with the vendors that you've added, with the sites that you've added, with maybe even subjects who've called a medical director and asked for help, or a site that's called a medical director. And audit your repository at that point for necessary communications. Again, before you do your marketing application, you'll want to make sure that your records are complete, that you've already done everything that I've already talked about in terms of mitigating fallout risks from the changes that you put in place, but also that your TMF is in line, because one of the first things the EMA related authorities will do will ask for that eTMF for their review. So it's important to have it as complete as possible. We always recommend you do this before the close of your study sites and before the closure of any of your relationships with your CROs, because it's easier to backfill at that point, of course. So with vendor management and oversight, I've touched on a lot of this already, but if you've added them quickly, make sure that you go back, you do your deviations, you do your documentation as necessary for unplanned deviations, you've done your qualification and selection, do your audits, do your internal process audits. If you've maintained in-house control, but you've had to change the way you oversee a process. If you've had to add personnel to oversee vendors, make sure that they have processes they're following or you're developing them. If you're a small sponsor, you will not necessarily have as many procedures as a large sponsor, because everybody knows you add procedures as you grow. But make sure that what you have documentation that is adequate to what you have done. And this would best be found through an internal process audit. Okay. Finally, I want to talk a little bit about auditing programs. Your portfolio and where you've done audits has probably been significantly affected. As someone who runs the auditing program here at MMS, I know that we've delayed a lot of audits, whether they're vendors, clinical sites, internal audits. Particularly clinical sites and internal audits have been delayed. Vendor audits to some degree have still been ongoing, and those are the ones we can most easily conduct remotely. But they may also be delayed. So make sure that you have deviations in place for the ones that you've had to delay. Make sure that you have reasoning in place when you haven't been able to go out to clinical sites. Assess whether or not a remote audit is appropriate. You can even at a clinical site get a lot of information out of a remote audit if the personnel are not available, such as the EMA, where the authorities are asking you not bother the clinical sites. You can still go through the TMF and the EDC. You can pick up protocol deviations, lack of AE reports, missing con meds, or incomplete information. You can also pick up bad monitoring. You can look at monitoring reports and pick up where there have been consistent issues that haven't been closed. There's a lot of information that we pick up just doing a document review, even at the clinical site, that we can pick up during a remote audit that will be beneficial to you. And things that we can't close, such as missing EDC data, or source data verification. Some monitors can still see the electronic medical records, so they can work with us to do medical data verification. If that's not possible, then you can, though, say this is a gap and do a much shorter on-site audit, so you have a combined audit process and you're not just letting the audits go for a prolonged period of time. So the takeaway is to reassess all your plans within the portfolio. Consider all these 4 areas and replan all of your audits. Internal audits as well, because you don't want to pressure other teams such as your CMC team or your PV team and do an audit when you don't really have necessarily time. They don't have time or bandwidth to handle that. As I've noted, document the reasons for changes to your audit plan and consider all your options. Finally, just to go through personnel training, as you've changed policies and procedures, go back now and train everybody if you haven't. If you've added anything for vendor oversight, if you've added changes to how you manage your informed consent forms, go back and make sure there's training. Because you're also dealing with a situation where people are dealing with emergencies, people might have a lot of late training. So it's worth it to go back and have managers review the training records and assess when training can be redone. Document that, for example, they didn't do training in March because of what we were dealing with COVID-19. However, we've just delayed that till June, and we put a concession in place, such as monitoring their workload or monitoring their performance in some other way. So consider what kind of mitigations you can put into place there. Again, ensure your vendors are doing the same thing, and this would probably be an audit of your vendors to determine that they are. And then, as I've noted, document the deviations and manage them with your quality assurance team. Okay, now I'm going to pass off to Ben, but I do want to just let you know that there's a lot of information you should be tracking as you look toward putting in your marketing application, your annual reports, and your clinical study reports. Any changes that you've made to your IPs, to your study calendars, to your protocol in any way, to your ICFs, any protocol deviations, any procedural deviations that affect your study. If you've added participants, SAPs, I'm not going to go through everything on the page here, but you absolutely need to keep track of it, because all regulatory agencies have requested that all of these types of details go in your final report and your application. You need a justification for any changes that you've made. That's why it's important now, is particularly if you're dealing with a study in its early or mid phases, because they can go on for several years, to go back and look at all these deviations you might have had and mitigate them. And you will have documentation in your quality management system that you'll be able to put into your final study report and your application. The regulatory authorities will be looking for detailed justification of your changes. Okay, so some of the other things that you'll have to look at, your monitoring will have to be discussed. If there was a change in monitoring and the impact on your study, were there negative impacts on your vendor services, et cetera, manufacturing, bioanalytical laboratory, any area that might be impacted. This includes animal studies, and I think that's an important point that we might be losing. But there have been some animal laboratories that have just shut down completely, and that could very negatively impact your animal studies. That leaves you very open to an inspection of those studies when you do your final application. So this is an area you definitely don't want to lose track of your documentation, and you'll want to have good deviation documentation and mitigation. Okay, and with that, I will pass over to Ben to talk about regulatory strategy.
Okay, thanks, Barb. You can move to the first slide, or to the next slide now. I'm sorry. So I want to focus more on submission planning and agency communication in the medium and the long term. I know this topic can be a bit overwhelming, so I'm going to keep my portion of the talk simple and pretty high level. Really my goal or my hope is that everyone can just take home a few pointers and suggestions that may slightly alleviate some of the anxiety over the next year or so and convert it into action, specifically around some of the things we can control, either while our studies are paused or while we're dealing with the challenges of ongoing clinical trials or in the planning process as well. I don't think there are currently a lot of concrete answers to questions of medium and long-term strategy. And where there are concrete answers, they are typically not generalizable. What I do think is that much of the uncertainty that we're dealing with can be dealt with through the tools that we currently have, and that proactively doing so represents a good use of sponsor resources. So with that in mind, I want to focus more on what we control now, what we can control now during this time of uncertainty. I view this really as an ongoing balancing act between risk management issues and issues of resource scarcity, both in terms of site and health authorities. So we'll need to deal directly with both of those. I'll talk briefly about some approaches to risk management and ongoing gap analysis, as well as how to prioritize interactions and effectively use agency time, which applies more towards the resource scarcity issue. So next slide. So to this point, available guidance has dealt mainly with risks to ongoing trials, which Barb has covered in some detail. Obviously, beyond that, there's a lot of unknowns that sponsors need to prepare for. So risk planning has a lot of downstream effects that span health authority interactions from pre-INDA to NDA and everything in between. So we really need to begin to think about how to organize these risks. So the way I've been thinking about this is sort of a hierarchical approach. So as a first step, sponsors really need to plan for risks that could require mitigation in advance of filing an amendment for any ongoing studies. So that is to say, developments that impose a new and imminent risk to the safety of clinical trial participants. Those are the code red risks and should be mapped out as early as possible, consistent with the current guidances that Barb summarized today. For the less urgent COVID-related risks that may require amendments, sponsors should really consider strategies for combining these amendments and harmonizing them across regions. In parallel with that assessment, I think if studies are paused or planned, this is a good time to consider building a kind of master appendix of generalized COVID-related amendments and procedures that could be incorporated across protocols. I think for planned protocols, and this is something I've seen sponsors doing a lot, a really good exercise is to consider at this stage, consider anything that might be successfully done remotely for a given study. So as you look through your protocol, consider monitoring shipment of IP, endpoints to be collected, and maintenance of drug supply. If you do this type of analysis in advance of study initiation, it can really help you not only just in terms of the study itself, but also realizing which studies to prioritize in terms of your IND submissions. Obviously, strategies for medium and long-term risks will vary depending on the program, but this is where you want to start tracking risks both in terms of the study and the overall application. I'm thinking in terms of risks related to missing data, validation of telemedicine, remote assessments, handling of dropouts, and compliance. I think what we really want to do here is ensure that these narratives are captured as early as possible and with appropriate support by data management, stats, and drug safety. We also want to ensure that any analysis related issues are addressed and discussed with the agency as soon as possible. I think another thing to think about is ultimately there's probably going to be some guidance here. I don't know when that's going to happen, but it's going to be critical for sponsors to be able to provide the right input into that guidance. So making sure you capture all of the analysis issues upfront in a well-organized way and revisiting that frequently is critical. It goes without saying that relevant team members in ClinOps, stats, data management, and safety should be involved as early as possible. Close collaboration with clinical PRs and other vendors will probably also be essential in terms of getting a broader picture, especially for smaller sponsors. In addition, as part of this risk assessment, be mindful of delays going forward for review, as the scarcity of reviewers is very likely to increase. So build that into timelines accordingly. and ultimately work towards what I call an actionable gap analysis. That's to say, a gap analysis that's organized in such a way to drive focused questions and allow for immediate inclusion in health authority briefing materials. You want to be building towards that at all times. So next slide. So I want to talk a little bit now about just strategies to deal with resource scarcity. Just as we have all had to adjust to the challenges of remote life over the last few months, the FDA has as well. In addition to adjusting to that challenge, reviewers are dealing with very large increases in workload due to the number of COVID projects and related amendments. So in that regard, and specifically in terms of communicating with the FDA, I would really emphasize the importance of proactively preparing your written responses. This will be critical now, but it's probably going to be critical forever after. I think this is one of those areas where COVID has kind of exacerbated a trend that was already pretty well set in motion. So generally, I think the attitude going forward should be prepare for every FDA response to be a written response. And hopefully won't be the case, but doing so will ensure the best quality of questions and briefing materials. Unfortunately, I think the skills that really come in handy when preparing a written response are probably the skills that have deteriorated the most in the information age. So just don't underestimate the degree of difficulty involved in bringing those skills back. It's really important to practice, consider how to word the questions, and ensure that sufficient background information has been provided to answer them. So a few suggestions for that. First, and I think this is really critical, build your questions and briefing materials in parallel. This is always a good idea, but when you're expecting a written response, it's not really optional. You don't want to send your questions out and then subsequently run into the problem of not having adequate time to cover them with your briefing materials. So avoid that at all costs. And interestingly, if you're preparing for a pre-IND interaction for a COVID study, this is actually required now. So just more evidence that the FDA seems to be moving in that direction. Second, if at all possible, you want to have someone less familiar with the project review the entire package and questions to ensure that the briefing materials provide adequate cover for the questions. You may even want to have that person or persons draft up some responses. It's a lot of effort, but frequently it can prevent getting a boilerplate response or a review issue type response. In general, your risk management and gap analysis work should serve you well in preparing for these communications. So where there are issues related to protocol deviations, missing data, or alternative or virtual methods for safety or efficacy assessments, these narratives should be built up through that process in advance of the meeting prep. And of course, if you're unsure about the adequacy of the response, employ additional support where needed. Next slide. So I think the other thing is really focusing on concise submissions. I started out my career as a medical writer, and I still understand applications primarily through writing about the data. So building concise submissions is something that's been on my mind a lot lately, even before COVID. However, as resources become more scarce, I've become kind of concerned about this tragedy of the commons type situations where there just aren't enough reviewer resources to meet current timelines. So preventing this is a mutually beneficial goal that really has two components. One is overall prioritization of submissions, and then the second one is just making sure you have very focused submission builds. So in terms of prioritization, I think this goes back to the risk assessment. It's very important to let a thorough risk management analysis be the primary driver of feasibility at this point. If that analysis is systematic, it should be possible to order potential INDs by likelihood of startup. So in my experience recently, the FDA is still meeting review timelines for these, but I think some degree of prioritization on the part of sponsors will ensure that continues to be the case going forward. I think it's still pretty early to predict the likely effects on ongoing development programs, but again, I think this is going to come down to risk management throughout the year and how it's ultimately captured in subsequent FDA interactions building up to the application. I think for the NDAs, just as we are building specific COVID-specific language into the protocols, the NDA reviewer guide is probably going to be really helpful in terms of focusing reviewers to that content, understanding key issues and mitigation plans. I think that's a tool that can be under leveraged at times, but it's very useful as a focusing device, and probably ultimately will serve sponsors well in the future for summarizing COVID-related issues. Part and parcel to that, by this point, all justification and validation of remote monitoring endpoints should be completed, and sponsors should be fully prepared to address any issues related to missing data. And I think that's all I had, Barb.
Thank you, Ben. Thank you, Barb. We really appreciate that. If anybody has any questions, go ahead and enter them into the Q&A window. Ben, we do have a question for you. For a COVID-19 application, do you recommend submission of a CTAP or pre-IND meeting request and briefing document?
My recommendation would be to go through the exercise of doing the pre-IND meeting request and the briefing document. So it would be a combined document. You know, most of the ones I've seen are very abbreviated. So if your experience is, you know, in some sort of the longer briefing packages that you may or may not be used to, I think err on the side of being concise, but put together sort of the standard pre-IND questions and requests.
Wonderful. Thank you, Ben. And if there's any other questions, like I mentioned, please feel free to add them in the Q&A window. We'll give you a moment to do so.
And while we wait, Don, I'd just like to go back to the point of keeping track of all of your changes. As you look at your portfolios and look at the studies that you have, as Ben pointed out, it's very, very important to have a concise, well-written application. So keeping track of all this information now is very important. And as he noted, having all of your risks identified and mitigated ahead of time. So going through that process of looking at what you've changed and if all of the subsequent processes have been followed to mitigate that change, document your deviations have been done, it's very important to have that done before you go through with your application. And that's really the focus we wanted to bring to this, is not telling you what to do to handle COVID, but what to do to handle all the changes that you've had because of the situation that we're in.
Wonderful. Thank you, Barb. And thank you to all for listening. We hope this conversation was helpful to you. In the meantime, please go ahead and follow MMS Holdings on LinkedIn, Facebook, or Twitter, whichever your favorite social network is. And we will be sending out a recording after this call. Thank you again, everybody, and have a great day.